I'm sitting in a parking lot, looking out my front window. It's dark, and it's getting cool out. It's quiet, and just far enough from the river that I can't hear it. I can see a garbage can and a short, concrete path that extends from the asphalt parking lot. It leads to some old wooden steps. Some of them look like they've been repaired. On either side are two handrails made of galvanized pipe, and they're bent from decades of use. They remind me of something my grandfather might have made by repurposing pipe from an old house. I get out of my car and start climbing the 16 steps. They take me up a grassy hill surrounded by tall trees that reach high into the southern sky, masking the stars. The hill is surrounded by a densely covered ravine, and the river is just 100 yards to my back. I see a structure made of wood. There are 3 boards lying parallel along the top. The middle board is cut on each end, and there's a square metal pole painted brown. I measured the boards, and they're 2 inches thick, a dimension of lumber that hasn't been made since the late 1960s. The wooden structure is attached to a steel frame that appears to be cemented into the earth. I scrape through the dirt surface and find an old aluminum pull tab from a can. The U.S. started moving away from these in the late 1970s because people would cut their feet on them, or in some cases, accidentally swallow them. Between the thickness of the wood and the aluminum tab, it's clear that this has been here for decades. I'm just 500 yards down the road from where 2 fishermen saw a couple during the early hours of September 18th, 1992. The couple seemed like they were intoxicated, and they saw the female fall and get up, then head to an overlook point just below the Gavins Point Dam. It seemed like they might have been arguing, and the female was leaning over the railing, then turned and walked away. The male followed behind as they disappeared, walking to the east. Approximately 15 minutes later, the fishermen remember seeing the reflection from car headlights off the tops of the trees. To the fishermen, they thought it was a car backing up, then turning clockwise and leaving. It's here, where I'm standing on this inconspicuous hill, exactly 29 years ago tonight, that some think Tammy was fatally injured, and I may be standing on the very spot that she died. This is the Footsteps in the Dark podcast, Season 1, Tammy Haas, Episode 9, and I'm your host, Chad Zimmerman. If you want to see the pursuit for truth in Tammy's case continue, please consider supporting us. You can do this in a number of different ways. First, you can join our Patreon site. This is where you'll find all of the in-depth analysis that went into our conclusions and lots of behind-the-scenes information. You can support us by buying merchandise, or you can donate. All of these options can be found on our website at footstepsinthedarkpodcast.com. And if you like the song by John Slap Myers, Tammy's Ghost, that we use at the end of each episode as a prelude to the next, please download it. It's just 99 cents and you can find it on iTunes. And as always, we thank you for your support. It really does mean everything to us. This podcast contains themes and language intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is advised. Every time I visit the town of Yankton, South Dakota, I stop by the Garden of Memories Cemetery to visit Tammy's grave. In the heat of the summer, the grass has turned brown, and there are patchy, barren spots. I envision it once plush with freshly cut green grass. The bronze nameplate on the headstone once had a shine, but over time, it's been oxidized and has lost its sheen. In many ways, it's a metaphor for this case. Once active with 6 agencies trying to discover the truth, it's fallen down the list of priorities. The case is old and cold, and the investigators who once worked the case have long since died, retired, or moved on, like many others have. It's just one of 340,000 cases that went unsolved between 1965 and 2021. Tammy's brothers, Mark and Paul, are middle-aged now and moved away from Yankton years ago, leaving their mother Nancy in the same home where Tammy and her brothers were raised, and where her husband Steve tragically died of a heart attack. Many of the decorations on the walls of the home and the furniture are the same as they were the day Tammy died, and this is common for those who suffer tragedy. And while it might be easy to judge as to the reasons why, those reasons are very private and personal. Like Tammy's brothers, many of those who were close to Tammy have left this small town in South Dakota. And while the grass might not actually be greener elsewhere, anywhere else is void of the constant reminders of the tragedy that's impossible to forget, as are the places where they spent time with Tammy and heard her laugh.
Michelle, what the hell is the tear gas for? I said, what the hell is the tear gas for? Is it?
They've tried, and some have made their peace, but none have forgotten. There's something about this case that people cannot let go of, and I'm hesitant to think answers will provide that for them. Like a tall tree whose roots have penetrated deep, so has the lasting legacy of Tammy's mystery, impossible to uproot and forever a dark cloud over Yankton's history. But the answers are there, somewhere, like whispers in the air during a thunderstorm, present but unheard. In today's final episode, we're going to go over the results of this investigation for the first time. For 2 years, we've searched for the simplest explanation that fits the facts of the case. As with each episode, I've tried to fully explain the thinking that went into the conclusions, and this episode will be no different, but I want to warn you. Chances are, if you're from the Yankton area and are familiar with this case, the results are likely different from what you may have believed for 30 years. Since reading the autopsy report, I've felt uneasy contemplating a murder, while people still talk about Tammy having a broken neck, and how that phrase leads to an easy conclusion of murder. It was the fact that it wasn't broken that made it difficult for me to make that leap of logic. This was further hindered by the lack of any bruises found beneath any of the abrasions she had, and how all of the notable abrasions were on her backside. It clearly looked as though she had fallen. As I read through the files and heard stories of Eric lighting candles and sleeping at her grave, I could almost feel the loss and grief he was feeling. And I had a hard time thinking he violently murdered her, only to keep coming back. And I wondered if he tried talking to her as he visited, and what he might have said to her under the cover of darkness. And I wonder what might have been going through the person's mind who visited her and ripped the sign from its concrete foundation, tossing it to the side in 2020. I went through my mental list of all the things I've been told from both sides. If it was a conspiracy of many people who knew and haven't talked, why hasn't anyone cracked in 30 years? I've spoken to some of them, and they all adamantly deny any knowledge, and have for 30 years. The records I found seem to paint a very different picture from the rumors that persist. It appeared there were some pieces to a puzzle known, and they were put together incompletely, like having 10 pieces of a 100-piece puzzle, and trying to make them fit to see the whole picture, resulting in filling in the blanks, and theories that fell apart once more pieces were found. I was left believing that there is someone that knows, but most likely, it is just one person that holds this burdened secret, and too much evidence points to Eric. Eric was the only person talking about Tammy being dead before she was found. He was the only person to have a shrine with candles, grieving before she was found. He's the only person to say he was the last to be with her. He is the only person who stated he might have killed a girl days before she was found. He was the only person who failed a polygraph. He was the only person who displayed knowledge of where she was found when brought to the scene. One or two things could be chalked up to a coincidence, but in Eric's case, he was right every time. And near the end of this episode, you're going to hear something that is too uncanny to have been an accident, which was Eric telling investigators where she died, but in such a way they missed it. I went back to the reasons that I've heard repeated as to why he couldn't have done it. He was too weak and had a bad shoulder. The trunk was too small. A body would have left more evidence in the trunk. It would have required more than one person to move her. These were all valid considerations, and they needed to be considered. Eric was 5'10" and 160 pounds at the time, about the same size I was at that age. He wrestled for a few years until he hurt the shoulder, but he remained active and had his own half-pipe ramp for skateboarding in his driveway. Wrestlers are trained to move people of the same size. people that are actively trying to resist. Tammy was 40 pounds lighter and wouldn't have been able to resist. She was paralyzed immediately at impact. Eric's injury to his shoulder, based upon interviews, was due to a dislocation. This occurs when the ball of the humerus bone pushes through the joint capsule, a dense matrix of ligament bands that holds it together in the shoulder socket. When this happens, it creates a weak spot and makes a person susceptible to dislocation again. But this happens when the arm is forced up and backwards, like a baseball player bringing back the ball to throw, and isn't a position he would have been in while moving her. As someone that deals with athletes with this kind of issue, I didn't find that argument particularly compelling. The injury would have made the shoulder more susceptible to injury, but he could still use it, and did. Further, Travis Novak testified that Eric had been complaining about his shoulder not long after Tammy was found, and it could be he re-injured it that night, trying to lift and move a 120-pound person. As for there not being enough body fluids found in the trunk, it begs the question, just how much are you supposed to find? And do we have to find any? We have to remember forensic science, trace evidence science. The stuff we're all used to seeing on CSI nowadays hadn't been invented yet. Further, she wasn't bleeding. She had scratches and scrapes, but only 3 of the abrasions were really notable in terms of severity. They were large, and there could have been a small amount of sticky fluid and blood, but unless those areas made direct contact with the carpet in the trunk, they wouldn't leave any. And we have to remember that given the nature of her injury, her heart would have stopped in 3 to 6 minutes. Thus, those abrasions would have only had few minutes to build up some fluid on the surface. Anyone that has ever slid into second base and scraped their shin or knee knows it takes a while for that fluid to accumulate on the surface, and it requires a beating heart. Further, had she been placed on her left side with her head on the driver's side of the trunk, how a right-handed person is most likely to lay someone down after carrying them on the right shoulder, neither the urine on the pants or the fluid on the scrapes would have made contact with the trunk. While she had sat in wet urine and this was found on the back of her pants, they could have been dry by the time her injuries happened, and this would prevent transfer to the trunk mat. And evidence suggests she may have been alive anywhere between 40 and 70 minutes after sitting in the urine and leaving the party. More than enough time for the urine to dry next to the heat generated by a warm-blooded body. As I examined this element, I could not find compelling reasons to exclude Tammy from being in the trunk based upon fluid evidence. But what about the trunk itself? During attorney Mike Stevens' closing remarks, he made it known that the trunk was very small, intimating it was too small to put Tammy in. And this would be something that could be easy to check. Simply find an old Beretta and go look at it. One evening I was scrolling through Beretta fan groups on Facebook and found an ad for one for sale near where I live. So I reached out to the owner and met with him the next morning. Morning, how are you? Good. This is going to sound really weird. I'm producing a podcast that's a true crime podcast that involves one of these. And so I've been trying to kind of find one around the same year, you know. It involves having possibly put somebody in the trunk of one. I'm trying to debate whether I want one for a little while to do a couple things with it, you know what I mean? Yeah, you don't come across very many of them where there's a one owner of them yet. Now, you pop the trunk? Yep. Can you do that?
It'll fit a body.
Well, what's interesting, in the trial, they make a big deal about how small the trunk is. Oh, geez. That wouldn't be hard at all.
To fit? No.
To my surprise, the trunk had plenty of space, over 13 cubic feet, or similar to a regular-sized refrigerator you might have in your own home. And Tammy wasn't very big, just 120 pounds. Deceased people are found in refrigerators and chest freezers every year. There was something else I only recently noticed that seemed to indicate just one person moved Tammy that night. If more than one person moved her, then why was she dragged across the road, resulting in superficial scratches on her lower back, wrists, and hands? And what about the sandburrs? The only place they could find a sandburr plant was near the roadside above where she was found. If 2 people had lifted her over, it'd be unlikely she'd have sandburrs stuck into the crotch of her underwear. And this was highly suggestive that only one person pulled her under the guardrail. This indicated to me that just one person was involved in putting her in the ravine. But what about the gas station clerk, Jennifer Jones, who remains adamant to this day that she saw Tammy the night she died around 1 a.m., nearly 30 minutes after the medical evidence suggests Tammy died? Though she got many details right about what Tammy was wearing, she also had some details wrong, and those details were a better match for the night before Tammy died, a night where Tammy did walk home and Jennifer was working. This is something I asked former Sheriff's Deputy Shane Topol the first time we spoke.
This was the night before that she saw her?
I think that was everyone's conclusion, was that it was the previous evening, because I think there was a receipt that indicated, whatever it was that she said Tammy bought. I think that they found one of those then that night before.
But could the couple seen that night have been someone else? Could this be a case of mistaken identity? On a normal Thursday night during the school year, most young adults would be at home. The reason kids were out that night was due to the homecoming festivities in Yankton and the party at the Stevenson farm. Otherwise, it was a pretty quiet night. The summer recreation season was done, and the only event going on in that area was the party. Thus, it is highly likely that the couple seen at the dam were there because they had gone to the party. And in 30 years, nobody else has ever come forward to say that they were the couple the fishermen had seen. And the descriptions of the couple fit Eric and Tammy well, with a minimal number of discrepancies. If the couple at the dam really was Eric's friends Brian and Katie, and they're part of some massive cover-up, why wouldn't they just admit that they were there? It would only help Eric by removing Eric and Tammy from that area and supporting Eric's alibi of being home. But both deny being there that night, Katie driving her car home and Brian going with Dusty and Kevin in Dusty's Bronco 2. However, height, build, and hairstyle descriptions were very close to Eric and Tammy. We also have to consider that the mistake on the female's hair color was due to unintended memory contamination. By the time one of them was interviewed on October 1st, 1992, 2 weeks had passed since they witnessed the couple. Tammy's picture had been in the newspapers and once found all over the news, and the pictures shown of her were with sandy blonde hair. Yet pertaining to the male, the descriptions were quite similar. Dark, curly, or wavy hair that was medium length or near the shoulders, which fit Eric. Could they have seen someone a different night? We have to remember that they were exactly able to pinpoint the evening as the evening Tammy disappeared. One of the fishermen had just gotten off parole the day before and planned a fishing trip with his brother for the next day. This was corroborated with the parole officer. The couple was seen the night in question. Thus, it is highly likely the couple seen that night were Eric and Tammy. And the fishermen had even told law enforcement they were sure that's who they saw. I sent letters to both fishermen, hoping we'd be able to touch base. 8 months after sending one of the letters, I received a strange text message from an out-of-state number. It was a picture of one of the letters I had sent, with 2 question marks. After some time, I was able to confirm it was one of the fishermen who was somewhat hesitant to talk, but we did have an exchange of text messages. I asked him if he was still certain the couple he had seen that night was Eric and Tammy, and he wrote, quote, "If we weren't certain it was them, we never would have gone to the authorities," end quote. And this makes sense. They were fishing illegally and risking trouble for themselves in talking. So what happened? Why were the fishermen dropped? They never testified at trial and would have provided an actual location where they were seen at a time matching the medical examiner's estimated time of death, helping the state's case against Eric Stukel. I asked the retired sheriff's deputy that very question. Here's Shane Topol.
Going back to something you touched on there that the private investigators put a lot of weight into was the reports from the fishermen. Obviously, and none of that ever came up at trial. Do you have any insight as to why the fishermen kind of got dropped from the narrative?
I don't know if you've gotten a chance to visit that area.
I've been down. Yeah, I know the area well. Yeah.
Okay, so the fishermen, if they were sitting where they were, at night, I think the feeling at the time was, and again, I can't speak exactly to it, but I remember there were people that we sent out to kind of reenact everything and see if they could even hear, a conversation. And, and so I think the fisherman's description too, if I'm not mistaken, became more clear over time, or at least they sharpened up their statements as to what happened over time. Some things that the private investigator talked about are seeing lights from the little picnic area and things like that. I'm not sure exactly how they projected that, or how they came up with that as being a possibility. But it's that area is actually around a little bit of a curve, and so it's possible they could have seen lights, but while they're doing all that, when the hell were they fishing? You would have had to have been looking for that. Is it possible that they saw Tammy and Eric arguing over there? Very possible.
Our own observations at the dam proved sound carries across the water, and anyone who spent time on a lake knows this. And this was an observation made by the female officer, the actual person pegged to pretend to be Tammy during the recreation almost 30 years ago. While law enforcement came to the conclusion that their story wasn't credible, the private investigators did not reach that same conclusion, and it was a small, innocuous detail shared by one of the fishermen to a Haas family friend in the late 90s, Gary Itt, that blew the doors of this case wide open. And it was such a minor detail at the time of the investigation that investigators never included it in their reports. Here's family friend Gary Itt, who got to know one of the fishermen for quite some time.
His recollection of things that happened that night, and I was concentrating mostly on the couple at the dam, and what they witnessed there. And he did volunteer some information on lights in the trees, though, car lights in the trees, and I just couldn't quite. I didn't pursue it any further.
Yeah,
because it just didn't really.
And Don said that James remembers telling the police originally about lights in the trees, and it also never got put in any report because for the same reason nobody thought it.
How's that relevant to this?
This was a detail the private investigator shared with me too, and he had confirmed it with one of the fishermen. About 15 minutes after the couple walked off to the east, the fisherman remembered seeing the reflection of headlights in the trees. The reflections appeared to be a car backing up, then turning towards the dam, then away from the dam, and disappearing to the east, indicating to the fisherman that the couple had left. The private investigators felt this was too small of a detail to simply make up, and it caused them to follow the road. And it led them to a small picnic park that sits atop a knoll, surrounded by a heavily treed, dry ravine. After checking over the area, they realized the only structure that would match Tammy's injury pattern was the picnic table. The bench matched the calf injury, the tabletop matched the buttock and the lower back, and there's a small 5-inch square pole with rounded edges, one on each side, that would match the small, linear, and nearly vertical abrasion to the back of the upper neck. To this point, everything seemed to be making sense, and it appeared Tammy had fallen back against the picnic table. But how and why? This is where speculation and a small but important mistake occurred. Semen was found on a swab of Tammy's vaginal canal, and the investigators found the testing report which showed the blood type and secretor status that matched Eric. But it was confusing, and they thought the sample was taken from Tammy's underwear, instead of internally at autopsy. And remember, the trial testimony hadn't been transcribed yet, and they weren't able to review Dr. Rena Roy's testimony that semen was not found on the underwear. The investigators thought Eric and Tammy had sex on the picnic table and were likely getting dressed, hence why Tammy's right foot was out of the pant leg and her panties were up. They felt Tammy most likely fell while getting dressed, and Eric may not have even seen her fall. It was because Tammy was intoxicated, lost her balance, and had a freak injury. And you can imagine how the family might have felt about that explanation. The private investigators would have a meeting with law enforcement, and upon conclusion of the meeting, were told to not go public with their findings. And shortly after the presentation, authorities were seen in Yankton, double-checking the private investigation findings. This scenario also didn't seem to fit Eric's confession at the restaurant more than 2 days later. If Eric was standing several feet away and Tammy fell, how could Eric possibly think he had something to do with her injuries? I was stuck at this point for quite some time, and then I realized something, and it happened one day while changing from my work pants to a pair of shorts. When I'm getting dressed, my right leg goes in first, but when I'm getting undressed, my right leg comes out first. This is due to side dominance, and I'm right-handed, and so is Tammy, and about 86% of people do this. Tammy's right leg was out of the pant leg, but her left foot was in. Tammy wasn't getting dressed, she was getting undressed. Yet there was one more detail I couldn't quite figure out: the abdominal contusion. Since the female seen by the fisherman seemed like she was hanging off the guardrail with the male behind her, the investigators thought Eric had pressed against her jokingly, and this caused that injury, causing her to storm off.
Well, that was the flat post-type object that we were looking for. Her alcohol level to begin with, and then Eric on top of her. And then we got the elevated noise coming from the fishermen that caught their attention looking up, and then her storming off. So my thought process on that part of it is the weight of Eric caused some type of a pain for her to suddenly take off.
But that seemed like a little bit of a stretch to me, and it seemed more likely that all her injuries occurred at the same time, not 20 minutes apart. It seemed that we were getting close to unraveling the mystery, and I had to get back to the park and try to recreate what happened, and try to put myself into their minds and actions that night. So I reviewed the autopsy reports again, and took another trip to the park. It was during this trip that the pieces started to fall into place. The couple seen by the fisherman seemed intoxicated, evidenced by seeing the female lose her balance and fall down, but not overly intoxicated as she got right back up. Eric and Tammy were both intoxicated, and the grass stains on her pants may be the result of that. The fishermen remember hearing raised voices, which caused them to look up and see them, and to them, it appeared that they were having a lover's spat. When Tammy's friend Erica saw Tammy at the party, she noticed they didn't seem to be getting along, but others at the party would say the opposite. Whatever was amiss didn't seem to be very serious. It may have been something simple, like Tammy being upset she didn't meet up with Travis to head to Vermilion to see Marjo, or her pants having gotten wet after sitting in urine in Eric's car. The more I reread the accounts of the fishermen, the more convinced I became that they saw Eric and Tammy, and it made sense. If she wanted to dry off her pants after sitting in urine, this was a common place close to the farm where they could take a walk, her pants could dry off, and if they were having a disagreement, they could give themselves some time to work it out. This means Eric didn't make a U-turn at the farm when they left, as he told investigators. He simply went out the back way, which takes you north to an intersection. If you go right, you head back to Yankton. If you go left, you head towards the dam. And just before the dam, there's a bit of a turn in the road, and right before it is the picnic park. From this point forward, I had to rely on the physical evidence, injury locations, and work through a common sense scenario. I'm going to walk you through what I think occurred that night based upon an in-depth review of the records and several trips to the park to recreate the events and the timelines. And I want this to be clear. This is my interpretation of events from that night based upon evidence. And this is what we have to consider. Tammy's pants were down with her right leg out of the pant leg. Her underwear was up, and no semen or any of Tammy's urine was found on her underwear, and her bladder was empty when found. There are only 2 reasons why pants would be coming down, and going to the bathroom was not one of them. All indications are that Tammy and Eric were going to have sex. And what 17-year-old boy is going to assault his girlfriend right before that? Eric and Tammy walked back to the park to sort out their differences, and they did. As often happens with younger couples, you kiss and make up, and things started to heat up romantically. Although Tammy had urinated in the trees at the farm before leaving, there is no evidence that Eric ever did, and he'd had a few beers. He realizes he needed to urinate and pees along the trees at the edge of the hill, and returns back to Tammy, and they continue their risque romantic interlude. Maybe Eric starts taking her pants down, and they know they have to look for a place to have sex. Seeing the picnic table, Tammy turns around and Eric is behind her, and his penis touches the back of her underwear, leaving the small drop of urine Dr. Rena Roy examined, which matched Eric's blood and secretor type. And this is important as no semen was found on the underwear, meaning the urine on the back of the underwear was only urine. Whereas if someone had just had sex and then went to the bathroom and then touched the underwear, spermatozoa may possibly be detected in that drop of urine. They walk towards the picnic table until they get there, and Tammy turns around and her back is towards the picnic table. She backs up until she feels the left leg against the bench and stops. Eric starts to help undress her and helps take her pants down, exposing her buttock, calf, and leg. Since Tammy is right-handed, she is posting for support on her left leg and raises the right leg to help pull it out of the pant leg, while Eric is pulling the pant. And suddenly, her leg pops out of the pant leg, resulting in a twisting motion to the right as she falls back, and her left calf scrapes the edge of the iron support as it comes off the ground. Her scrape was 12 inches above her heel, and there is one corner on one table at the park where the iron support holding up the bench is still exactly 12 inches above the ground. The scrape has a straight edge matching the straight edge of the iron support. As she's twisting and falls, her right buttock hits the edge of the top of the tabletop, leaving a square-like scrape in a direction similar to the calf abrasion, indicating both were created when her body was turning. The impact on her right side halts the rotation and creates a momentum shift. The next scrape on her lower back appears more vertical as her body straightens and begins to shift towards the left. The two scrapes are separated by the panty line, indicating they were still up when she fell. As she fell backwards, she tucks her head to protect it, a natural response to falling, resulting in an already flexed position with the ligaments in her neck already taut when the pole hits the back of her head, tearing the ligaments in her spine and damaging her spinal cord, leaving only a light abrasion on the top layers of the skin a half-inch wide, matching the rounded corner edge of the vertical pole. She is immediately paralyzed and cannot breathe. As she falls back against the bench and tabletop, unable to move or speak, likely only able to communicate with the look in her eyes. Eric immediately recognizes she is seriously hurt, and she cannot respond since her diaphragm is paralyzed, and she cannot talk. She needs help. He runs to the car and starts it, turning on the light so he can see in the dark, and he drives up the hill, causing the lights to point up into the trees. He hits the trunk release button and goes back to Tammy, kneeling down as he pulls her toward him from the table and lifts her up. As she comes down, his shoulder presses into her paralyzed abdomen, resulting in the abdominal injury due to lack of abdominal tone and resistance. He carries her to the trunk and opens it and lays her down in the trunk on her left side. And since it is almost about 40 minutes since she sat in the urine, her pants are dry, leaving no traces of urine in the trunk mat. And since she's on her side, no traces of blood or fluid from the abrasions. His first instinct is to find help, but is late on a Thursday night in 1992, and they are in the middle of nowhere. No cell phones, no payphones, and no businesses open in the area. With the picnic table and trees on the hill, driving forward and turning may have been difficult, so he backs down the hill on the east side. Without enough room to turn left due to the trees, he makes a 270-degree turn towards the dam and then away from the dam, just as the fisherman described, and he heads back to the east to where Highway 121 merges. He decides to drive to the closest place he can think of to find help, back to the Stevenson farm, where friends might still be. But when he gets there, he discovers everyone has left and the door is locked. He checks on Tammy, and by now, she's run out of oxygen and her heart has stopped, having died in the trunk of the car while on the way back to the farm. She's gone, and he's several miles away from a hospital. He's underage, intoxicated with alcohol and marijuana. She's injured, and her pants are down, and the reality sets in. Nobody will believe his story, and they will blame him for her death, and he panics. He turns around and takes the gravel road back to the highway, looks left, and sees the trees sticking up out of the ravine, the first place with adequate cover, and pulls his car just past the middle of the ravine, stops across from the golf course, lifts her out of the trunk, leaving a few hairs in the trunk, while trunk mat fibers and the plastic particles remain on her clothing. The awkwardness of lifting her from the trunk strains the unstable shoulder in the process, and he drags her across the road, unable to lift her, leaving small flakes of yellow paint on her pants and light abrasions to the back of her wrists and hands. He gets to the guardrail and turns her parallel to the road and steps over it and pulls Tammy under it, feet first, causing sandburrs to attach to the crotch of her underwear. Her shirt and jacket slide upwards, and the gravel or asphalt on the shoulder produces light, short scratches on her lower back. He then rolls her down the hill where she will be found, right next to the golf course, and plenty of time for livor mortis to set in that position. He goes back to the car, grabs her purse and shoes, and throws them into the ravine and drives home, and likely has a sleepless night, as everything ran through his mind, and he tries to figure out what to do next. Perhaps he falls asleep and wakes up, wondering if what happened was just a bad dream. He begins experiencing the first stage of grief, denial, leading to his out-of-place comment the next night, that he wants to marry Tammy. Maybe the denial causes second-guessing, and he wonders if she came to and is all right, leading to paranoia and a feeling that he has to check on her. Maybe he goes back to that area once she's reported missing and discovers she's still there, and she really is dead, and reality sets in. And he tells Tammy's friend Dee Dee that night, when asked where she is, that she's probably dead in a ditch. Hours later and intoxicated, Eric ends up in the restaurant, where the finality of her death seems apparent, and he's wondering if something he did led to her injuries when he says, "I think I might have killed a girl." When her body is found and investigators think she was shot and murdered, Eric displays knowledge that she wasn't shot, and the focus is to try to avoid being charged with a murder for an accident. But his subconscious won't let go. He's brought to the scene and leads investigators to where she was found. The emotion wells up inside of him, and he writes a farewell letter in the notebook to his family, only to have the sanctity of an attorney and the feeling of support prevent another tragedy from unfolding. And from this point forward, Eric buttoned up and let law enforcement try to put the pieces together, something they were unable to do. And while law enforcement worked, Eric silently mourned the loss of the girl he loved, and he would visit the grave from time to time, holding a deep secret that only Tammy and he would share for 30 years. I'm reminded of the strange triangular stone he placed on her casket and wonder, what did it mean? 3 sides. Almost like one side represents him, one side Tammy, and the other representing a truth that binds them for eternity. At some point in time after having put together how Tammy likely died, and how Eric would have taken her back to the farm in the trunk of his car, where she likely died, I found a copy of the letter he had written to Tammy 2 days after she was found, while being interrogated by law enforcement. When after he failed the polygraph, they asked him to write down whatever it was he couldn't say, and what I read caused me to shudder in dismay. He wrote, "T, I know you were in this room watching me get blamed for things that happened when I was at home dreaming. I can still remember that dream. You had left for New York for college. I found myself looking for you. I wound up at an old lady's house asking about you. She pointed to the car that was in her garage, and it was all bashed up. She said that you had died in it. I woke up in the AM sometime. I knew I would never see you again. I know I was the last to love you and be with you. And now I'm being asked the same questions over and over. But I'm telling the truth, and you know that. I love you and miss you a lot already, but I'll be okay. And when I die, I will find you. Signed, E." And once again, Eric is correct. She died in the car. But it was his car. And this was written 2 days after she was found, about a dream that happened 6 days before she was found. A dream he told Marjorie Swedeen about 4 days before she was found. And a dream he had before anyone else knew she was missing or dead. I found an FBI interview with Marjorie Swedeen regarding her visit with Travis Novak to Eric's house just a few days after Tammy went missing. In this report, she remembered Eric trying to tell her about a dream. The same dream, where Tammy had gone off to school in New York. But Eric stopped short of the old woman and car story. Was Eric trying to tell the truth but in a non-incriminating way after being asked to, quote, write down anything he couldn't say, end quote? The old woman mentioned is the opposite of him, a young man. And the bashed up car? When he wrote it initially, he used lowercase letters, then went over it again and capitalized them for more emphasis. Was this another misdirection? After all, his car wasn't all bashed up. Since law enforcement never had a theory, they never realized the significance of Eric's words. That just like his dead in a ditch comments that were true, Eric also knew that she died in a car. This made me go back and reread what he had written the night after he wrote the letter to Tammy for investigators on September 25th, 1992. When at the get-together with other grieving friends, a journal was passed around, and Eric wrote, "To T, I love you. I'm telling the truth, aren't I, T? See you in another life. I love you, Mom and Dad and brothers and sisters, and I love you, Tammy Haas. I'll never forget you, honey." End quote. It read like Eric's farewell note to his family, and that's exactly how investigators interpret it. Written on the day he failed a polygraph, and wrote about her dying in a car. And for the second time, he makes the plea to Tammy that she knows he's telling the truth. After all, he didn't kill her. She was dead in a ditch, and she died in a car. This brings me back to something the private investigator Don had said in his interview with me about the polygraph. Eric was deceptive, meaning there were things that were true amongst the things that were false. Tammy did walk home the night before. They did have sex the night before. She did die in a car, just not the old woman's. The easiest way to lie is to make sure most of it is true. On January 10th, 1994, law enforcement put a wire on Josh, the server that heard Eric's confession, and had him go to Eric's house to see if he could get Eric to talk about what he'd said. I found a transcript of this conversation. The conversation is a bit painful to read, as Josh was clearly instructed to behave as though he was distressed and panicked, and he has a hard time getting to the right place to bring up the conversation from that night. Here's the important excerpt From the transcript. Josh: I don't know nothing about it, and then that night you came in, you were you looked like you were upset. Eric: Yes, I'm sure I was. Josh: And I asked you what was wrong, and you said something about killing a girl or the death of a girl. Eric: Yeah. Josh: And that freaked me out. Eric: The death of, I never said, probably the death of a girl. Josh: Okay, cause that freaked me out, man. Eric: Yeah, but see, I don't even really remember going in there because that was a long time ago. End quote. Eric doesn't deny he said something, which was telling. But almost a year and a half later, he distances himself from what he said presented with the option by Josh. Instead of kill, he must have said something about the death of a girl, more than 3 days before anyone else knew she was found. I was reminded of a notation I'd seen in a report dated July 16th, 1993, several months before Josh tried to get Eric to talk. The notations were from an interview with a confidential informant, and it begins by saying the informant is, quote, very reliable, trustworthy, and honest and close to both families, end quote. In this report, it says, quote, Stuckel family had an investigator from Sioux Falls, went to Sioux Falls to check out autopsy, end quote. By the time Josh tried to get Eric to talk, Eric knew about Tammy's injuries and likely knew he had little or nothing to do with her death. And by the time he was approached by investigators in September of 1995, he was interested in taking a new polygraph. After all, he knew he hadn't killed her, and he wanted to prove it. But investigators showed their hand by telling him how they'd changed the pertinent question and asked him if Tammy was alive or injured the last time he saw her, and Eric didn't show. After piecing it all together, I became convinced that Eric knows the truth, and he's tried to tell people he didn't kill her, and it was the number of ways he tried to do that which stuck with me. He voluntarily went to Nancy Haas's home and sat in her kitchen and told her he didn't kill Tammy. He befriended Tammy's brother Mark and told him not to believe the rumors. He denied it on a polygraph 2 days after she was found, but failed, likely still questioning whether he had done something that made her fall. He approached Sheriff's Deputy Shane Topol the next summer because he was upset that people thought he killed her. When a family member of Eric's called him killer, he got angry. Every time law enforcement tried, he told them he had nothing to do with her death. And he tells investigators that the only time he was sober during the questioning was the day of the first polygraph. And when confronted by law enforcement about impending charges, he asks for another polygraph. He meets with Tammy's mother at a park and again tells her he didn't have anything to do with her death. He twice wrote pleas to Tammy invoking her spirit and proclaiming she knows he's telling the truth. And while it isn't anything new for guilty criminals to deny their crimes endlessly, the sheer number of ways he did this was striking. However, it wasn't the whole truth, and every day the lie is told, the hole gets a little deeper. As more and more people are affected by it, and you eventually get so deep you can't see a way out, and you get to the point where you'll lose all that you have left, the very support from the people that believed the lie for 3 decades. The burden of the truth becomes so heavy that when confronted by a sign pleading for it made by those who believe he murdered her, rage and anger take over as you rip the sign from the ground and toss it aside, but knowing deep inside that it'd all be over had you taken a right turn instead of a left and just told the truth. On September 18th, 2022, exactly 30 years to the day Tammy died, Tammy's family members held a short ceremony at her gravesite in Yankton. In this clip, you'll hear family friend Gary Itt, as well as Nancy's neighbor and close friend Arlette.
If you got something in mind, you got some thoughts, I know.
I often wonder, I still remember her as 18, and it's hard to think of her as being 48, or 40 would it be? 49.
Yeah, 49.
And, you just think of where would she been now? She probably was a mother. She could have even been a grandmother. And it's just, she missed out on so much of life. And it's hard to accept the fact that after all this time, we still don't really know what actually happened.
During the ceremony marking the 30th anniversary of her death, Tammy's family and friends spoke of memories of her. Memories that have faded into mere snapshots of a once vibrant soul. One person began talking about all of the world events Tammy had missed in the last 30 years, such as 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. I looked up and saw Nancy standing near the back of the group, and she was crying. For the first time in a year and a half that I'd been talking with her. And that's when I learned that although 30 years had passed since the eye of the storm had hit, there are still those moments when a mother's love and loss of her daughter still breaks through. The next morning, I stopped by Nancy's. I'd left some equipment there. I began thinking of her brother Mark, walking up the front steps on her graduation, and the gathering of friends and family behind the house. And I walked behind to the patio, which now stands void of the energy and presence it once felt when the home was full of children playing outdoors, and her husband working in the yard. The railings around the patio look old and weathered, much like the old 2-story playhouse out back. The boards unpainted and loosened under the repeated stress of the passing seasons. As I entered the playhouse, I found several old toys scattered about, wondering if Tammy and her brothers had played with them. And I scanned the wooden interior walls looking for traces of Tammy. Maybe something she'd written on one of the walls. But like the faded memories shared the day before, any trace has been lost to weather and time. As I stood alone in the backyard, I was overcome with the realization of how 3 decades changed us and robbed us of our youth, and how the memories of our loved ones we've lost gradually fade from clear video with color and sound to mere snapshots of black and white. And though we may try to bring it back into focus and color, faded memories are often all we have. I was reminded of the many times I've heard Nancy attending the funerals of others in the area, and how her presence is an instant reminder to others of Tammy, and how much Nancy doesn't want people to forget her daughter. As I reflected, I found myself realizing I'd been touched by the ripple effect of Tammy's life, trying to tell a story that would impact others, and help make sure the energy of Tammy's ripples are felt by others. But I didn't know how to conclude this journey. I had sent Eric a letter several months before, asking for his participation in this documentary podcast. I knew he had received it because one of his extended family members had confirmed it with me. I happened to be in the area for an event and decided to drive by his house. It was a Sunday shortly before noon, and I thought it might be a good time to see if he was home. It's a small, tan house that sits up on a hillside. There are 2 windows to the left of the front door, and a small window to the right. There is a window on either side of the house just below the peak of the roof, and a single-car detached garage that sits atop the concrete driveway behind the house. I could see a basketball hoop between the house and the garage. The garage door was closed, and the house was dark inside. As I walked up the steps to the house, I saw a small gargoyle figurine sitting on the front steps, as if it were guarding it. I pressed the doorbell twice. Nothing. I could see the flicker of television inside and the shelves on the floor with dozens of CDs. After waiting a few minutes without a response, I left.
He answered.
I had just one question for him, and it was along the lines of the questioning that law enforcement wanted to ask during the second polygraph he had requested, but didn't show up for. Was Tammy alive or injured in any way the last time you saw her? The next morning, I thought about returning to see if I could catch him at home. I had sent a message to one of his friends, Jason Adamson, asking whether he thought Eric would talk with me or not, and the reply changed my mind. It read, quote, "It isn't his place. Fact. It's an unband-aidable wound, but you're going to change that," end quote. Jason believes Mike Cruz killed Tammy, and he didn't feel it was Eric's place to talk. It was Mike's. But Mike already had. This got me to thinking. Maybe it wasn't my place to ask Eric that question. After all, why would he talk to me? After the podcast had already launched, and as we were nearing the halfway point, I reached out to Eric one last time with a letter. Shortly after 10 p.m. on May 30th, I received a reply from him. It began with a link to the song Vigil by the Mars Volta, then read, quote, "You're not wanting it for your bullshit. What were you doing 30 years ago on this day? You think I'm an idiot. My lawyer will shut this down tomorrow. Advocate for me, God." End quote. After this exchange with Eric, I decided it was no longer my place to try and ask him the question. Maybe that question should be asked by those closest to Eric, who, like law enforcement, seem to have always asked the wrong questions for more than 30 years. Maybe someone else will have better luck. I looked up the lyrics to the song Vigil that Eric had sent to me, and they read, in part, "I know the way he makes you hide even when the dose is fight or flight. And the obits wait for a perfect name, clean out the whims he left behind, and if you want, I can bury him out by the Salton Sea in an empty grave. The past has a way of coming clean. If I didn't know any better, I could have sworn you said there will come a day for his reckoning. It's the want of the weight when it crushed, all of the centrifugal ways our lives fall in and out of place. One day you're going to see that everybody who claimed that you and love have left, because one by one they would disappear, claiming all your words were symptoms of deceit. Some time ago, after I developed a good idea about what happened to Tammy, I knew I had to ask her mother, Nancy, a difficult question. After being led to believe her daughter was murdered 30 years ago, was she going to be okay if the answer turned out to be much like what the private investigators believed, that Tammy's death was a tragic accident? She told me that she'd been there before in terms of that kind of situation. But there was one more thing.
Yeah, well, there was no accident that she was thrown down that ravine to lie there for 5 days. That part was no accident. And yeah, the horribleness of that doesn't give him a pass, though.
And she's right. Although we might be able to justify why somebody would panic, it doesn't excuse the fact that Tammy required a closed casket funeral. As I reflect on this journey through the muddy waters of the Tammy Haas case, I think Gary Itt said it best.
It is the darndest case. I think that's why I'm sure it kind of intrigues you. Because it's got every aspect of human nature in it mixed in, and how do you separate all this out and figure out what's the truth? That's the challenge. I understand that.
Tammy's case exposes the greatest weaknesses of our human psyche, how we can get tunnel vision and our tendencies to fill in the blanks. It illustrates how beliefs cause our passionate nature for righteousness, and how we can become convinced of things that aren't real. It reminds us of how our own fear paralyzes us and keeps us from doing the right thing, and how our sense of self-preservation can be rationalized. Yet, the truth has no feelings. It makes no blunders of thought. It merely is. And it is the basic nature of it that provides comfort in its simplicity, and why we strive endlessly for it, hoping when revealed it eases our restless soul, and by doing so, puts Tammy's to rest. The photograph used for our cover art was taken at the picnic table, exactly 30 years to the day from Tammy's death. And just like the answers to this case, has been right there in front of us this whole time. This has been the Footsteps in the Dark podcast, Season 1, Tammy Haas. May she rest in peace. And now the full song, Tammy's Ghost, written by John Slat Myers, inspired by Tammy's case. Available at iTunes. This podcast was written and produced by me, your host, Chad Zimmerman. The song featured in the trailer, Tammy's Ghost, was written and features John Sapp on vocals, guitar, and bass, Matt Gedney on guitar, Adam Jones on drums, and Laura Egan and Carl Graber on horns.